Wow, first Vitruvian book review in a minute, and this is a good one. So I just finished this morning David McCullough's book, Mornings on Horseback, about Theodore Roosevelt, and I got to tell you, it's one of the best books I've read in a long time. It's one I've had, I probably bought this book 5, 6 years ago, maybe more. It just sat on my shelf, and then finally I decided I wanted to read something completely different, and it turned out to be much more than what I expected. So a little bit about Teddy Roosevelt. So I knew very little about Theodore Roosevelt. I know he's one of the most popular presidents that we've had. I know about the Rough Riders and the Battle of San Juan Hill and his time as a rancher in the Badlands, just his love of animals, the national forest, being the trust buster, all the stuff we learned in school, and also him just being probably one of the most colorful figures we've ever had serve in the White House. But other than that, I didn't know much about Theodore Roosevelt. And what this book does is it takes you back to starting with his parents and his grandfather and their coming to America via New York and how they became one of the most prominent families in New York. In fact, his dad, Theodore Sr., was one of the guys that really shaped New York City, and they're definitely as blue blood as you can get on the Eastern Seaboard and in New York and Oyster Bay and all that area. And I knew nothing about his father. Well, it turns out that Theodore Sr., which is where Theodore Jr., Teddy, TR, got a lot of his personality, his morals, his values, was this larger-than-life figure, but not for the reasons why his son was. This was just a good and decent guy. He was one of these old-school, really wealthy merchants who realized that to whom much is given, much is expected. And so in addition to being one of the top, most notable socialite families in all of New York, Theodore Sr. also made a very, very active point to help those in need. He served at an orphanage. He was constantly there mentoring young boys and trying to help them, even some of them going so far as putting them in other states with different families to find them a place where they could go and have a better life. So a really, really cool guy. Another thing that I didn't realize was that I had no idea that Theodore Roosevelt was married before. He had a wife, Alice, that was a Southerner, that was from Georgia, and as a result, right after he got married, he had to Alice, she had brothers fighting for the Confederacy in the South while Theodore was a Northerner. And so her family, the Bullocks of Georgia, they were a staunch Southern family and married into this very Eastern Seaboard Northern family. So Seaboard Northern family. So that was kind of interesting to learn. Then I think one of the most powerful characters in TR's life was his sister Bammy, who was thought to be destined to be an old maid for the rest of her life, or a spinster, as they were called back then, as referenced in McCullough's book over and over. She had a really bad back ailment, like it was kind of like scoliosis or something to that effect, and she just was notably ugly. She wasn't pretty, but eventually at the age of 40, she gets married, but she was kind of like the head of the family. She was this really cool figure that even though she was not attractive, she was in constant pain, she was so strong, and you can tell she was the one that TR relied on so heavily in all of his affairs when he would go overseas, when he'd go on his long hunts or off to the Badlands where his ranch was. She was always the one that basically held down the fort. So a really, really cool figure from TR's life that I'd never heard of before. And then also what you learn is that Teddy Roosevelt, although I think a little bit more has been made, according to David McCullough, about him suffering from asthma and other ailments. He did, in fact, suffer quite a bit. And he was a sickly young guy, and basically throughout the rest of his life was always battling some sort of, either asthma or a bad disease or something, but was tough as a freaking boot. And one of the things that comes through over and over in this book was that Teddy Roosevelt, the harder the circumstances, the more pleasure he took in it. The dude was unbelievably strong and strong-willed and just very, and you get the sense that, very different than most men these days, especially politicians, he was a righteous guy. there's nothing, at least there was nothing that David McCullough wrote in this book that gives you any indication that Teddy Roosevelt was in any way a sleazy politician. In fact, he nearly didn't go into politics at all. He was in politics, and then he bought a ranch out in the Badlands of the near the Dakotas. I think it was in South Dakotas where his ranch was. And he went out there and lived the cowboy life, which is another thing that's really cool. So his life was before kind of the romanticized cowboy that came, I guess, in the early 20th century. And so he actually lived among cowboys and really respected them. And McCullough does a good job of describing and painting a picture of what these men who kind of lived out on the frontier alone. They valued hard work, integrity, listening more than speaking, and just, it was really cool. And then the fact that Theodore Roosevelt, this guy that had all the money in the world, the Roosevelts were extremely wealthy. He never worried about money, but that didn't keep him from working very hard and never skirting his responsibilities as a rancher. He actually, he kind of like the gentleman rancher. He's got all the money. He owns all the cattle. He owns the big house. So therefore, he really doesn't have to do a lot, which he talks about. He enjoyed being a rancher, and he made the distinction between rancher and cowboy. But he was not afraid to go out. And in fact, he easily could have lost his life in the middle of a stampede that happened in the middle of the night that the book describes, that Theodore was right in the middle of it. And so just a really, really cool book. And let's see, I marked a couple of things that I found memorable. There was a page that I marked just this morning as I was reading that I thought was really cool. This is something, and this kind of sums up how Theodore Roosevelt was as a man and how he faced adversity. Long afterward, he was to write, "There were all kinds of things of which I was afraid at first, ranging from grizzly bears to mean horses and gunfighters. But by acting as if I was not afraid, I gradually ceased to be afraid." And that seems to be, this was him describing his time in the Badlands, working on his ranch. And you get the sense that that is exactly how Roosevelt was. Anytime there was resistance, fear, nerves, hardship, he just faced it head on. Now, most of the family that people know about these days with regard to Roosevelt, it was with his second wife. And the reason why we don't know much about his first wife, Alice, is because he never spoke of her. In the book, it describes how he basically had this philosophy that the best way to move forward and to move on is to put the past in the past, that it was indulgent and morbid to even bring up the past. So he even wrote in a biography, his own autobiography, he never wrote about his first wife. And he had a daughter with her who he gave very little attention to. It was kind of odd in that regard. And so that was one of the oddities of him. And he was very good at compartmentalizing his thoughts. Very, very brilliant. You can tell he's a brilliant mind. I could not more highly recommend this book. I want to see if there was something else that I don't want to leave anything out. There was something else I wanted to say as part of this review. Oh, so I didn't know this. So FDR's connection to Teddy Roosevelt. So it turns out that Theodore Roosevelt's brother, Elliot, who died at the age of, I think, 34 of alcoholism and just a real troubled soul. Sounds like a really sweet guy. He was actually older than Teddy, and so therefore was supposed to, but his dad always knew, no matter what, that he would not be the one to take over the family business and kind of become the patriarch of the family once he was gone. He always knew it would be Teddy, not his older brother. So Teddy's older brother was godfather to FDR. Okay, you follow me? And Teddy's, Elliot, Teddy's brother's daughter, ended up marrying FDR, who was a cousin. Now, somebody might want to correct me on that, but that's the way I read this. I didn't do a Google search, just finished the book and did this review. So it looks to me like FDR and Eleanor were cousins, and also her father was godfather to FDR. Kind of bizarre. So anyway, so that's kind of how they're connected there. And it talks about how the Roosevelts made their money. They weren't robber barons. In fact, a lot of the money was just made as merchants. They came over, and where they started really making money was Theodore Sr. owned a plate glass business that did really well, provided kind of their cash flow, and then started investing in property and that sort of thing. But it looks like it was cool just learning that history of the Roosevelt family. I have a fascination. This is something too. It's kind of like a ancillary benefit. I have a fascination with New York. My wife and I go there a lot. I love going to New York. I love the city. I love its history. I'm actually also finishing up. Actually, I've done a review on it. I'm reading some of it again. The Power Broker, about Robert Moses, the city planner and builder who actually built most of the most notable infrastructure for New York. So just a sidebar, it's a good book. But if you like reading about some New York history in addition to the Roosevelts, then Mornings on Horseback. Great book, highly recommend it. An incredibly colorful character. I now see why so many people love Theodore Roosevelt. I get it now. He was like, I don't know, the most colorful, adventurous, and good and decent and funny and just kind of odd president that we've ever had. And that's saying a lot for the United States of America. So anyway, check it out. I think you'll enjoy it.